Full Cast Audio presents Ivy by Katherine Coville. Chapter 1 Grandmother's Garden. Once upon a time, in the kingdom of Evermore, there lived a small, round girl named Ivy. Ivy had a way with animals. Beasts and birds were not afraid of her. They let her touch them, and feed them, and carry them, and though she couldn't understand their languages, she seemed to know what they liked. Ivy lived with her grandmother, whom the villagers called Meg the Healer. Grandmother was known far and wide as a healer for all the creatures of the farms, fields, and forests, and Ivy was her helper. Ivy had lost her mama and papa when a terrible fever passed over the land, and so she had come to live with grandmother in the peaceful village of Broomsweep. Broomsweep was a very clean and orderly place. In fact, that's why it was named Broomsweep. All the cottages were clean. All the streets were clean. Every garden bloomed with flowers planted in straight rows, each flower exactly the same height. No one ever made messes or raised a ruckus. All the children and pets were clean and orderly too. Every morning and every evening, the people of Broomsweep swept their front steps. Then they stepped back to admire their nice, clean cottages and nodded in satisfaction. Everyone except Ivy's grandmother. Her cottage was surrounded by a big, overgrown garden. It was the very last cottage on the outskirts of town, next to the dark forest. It was a good place for grandmother to do her work. But grandmother did not sweep her front steps twice a day. The truth was that some days she did not sweep them at all. When the people of Broomsweep walked past her cottage, they would sniff and shake their heads in disapproval. Still, if the villagers needed help with their farm animals or pets, they brought them to grandmother's cottage for her to heal. Ivy soon learned that even wild animals who needed help knew where to find grandmother. They would make their way to the cottage and scratch at the back door. And once in a while, in the dark of night, her grandmother told her, something magical, like a dragon or a griffin, might slip through the forest, seeking her help.
If you should ever see a dragon,
grandmother warned her,
be very polite.
So Ivy practiced being polite with all the small animals. One day, Ivy sat on the back steps, holding a chipmunk in her lap while grandmother examined him.
"It's all right, little Chippy,"
Ivy crooned. Her gentle voice and touch were almost as good as grandmother's for calming a nervous creature, and the chipmunk held still, except for when he sneezed.
Tell me what you see, Ivy,
said grandmother, whose old eyes didn't work very well. Ivy held up the wee chipmunk and looked into his face thoughtfully.
"His eyes are clear, and his ears are nice and pink, but his nose is runny."
Ah, just a cold, I think. A little sneezelwort potion should help. I'll hold him while you fetch it.
The chipmunk made a chittering noise as Ivy handed him to grandmother. Ivy chittered back. She was very good at imitating animal sounds, although she didn't know what she might be saying. Ivy went to the cupboard in the cottage and read the labels on the potion jars the way grandmother had taught her. She knew how important it was to get the right potion.
Take your time,
grandmother always told her,
and check everything twice.
So Ivy took her time and read the labels out loud.
Let's see. Worry tonic for the nerves, scratch the itch powder, claw polish, limber juice for stiff joints, sneezelwort for sneezes.
She picked up the jar and checked the label again, then took it to grandmother.
Good,
said grandmother.
That's very good.
Ivy smiled happily. She liked to be helpful.
Now, mix 3 drops with half a spoonful of oats. Feed him the oats and send him to bed. He can stay in the empty burrow under the apple tree until he feels better.
Ivy's sharp eyes and small hands made her very good at measuring. She followed all of Grandmother's directions and then set the chipmunk down under the apple tree.
Go on in, little chipmunk. This hole's for you.
The chipmunk sneezed. Ivy took a handful of milkweed fluff from her pocket and placed it next to the empty burrow for his bedding. She pushed a clump of the fluff toward him with her finger. The chipmunk sneezed once more. Then, taking the fluff between his teeth, he disappeared down the hole. Ivy smiled with satisfaction. She drew a bucket of water from the well and made her way through the overgrown berry bushes to a bigger burrow, where an injured fox and his mate crept out to meet her and allowed her to scratch behind their ears.
Good morning, Master Fox. Mistress Fox, how's the tail this morning?
She asked, as she offered each of them a little treat from her pocket. The injured fox held still as she removed the bandage from his tail.
You really must be more careful of traps,
she warned him. Then she washed his cuts and gave him a fresh bandage and offered him another treat. Ivy was just turning back to the cottage, brushing at the dirty paw prints the animals had left on her apron, when she heard voices coming from the road in front of the garden. Children's voices. Ivy ducked down and crept silently toward them. She knew all the animals' secret pathways through the garden. She could go from the privet hedge at one end of the garden to the hazel trees all the way at the other end without being seen. This time, she stood up when she came level with the children and said,
Hello.
3 children stopped and stared at her.
Oh, look,
said the biggest girl. It was Edwina, the shoemaker's daughter.
It's the dirty little girl from the wild woods.
Ivy looked down at her apron. It was smudged with paw prints, little ones from the chipmunk and bigger ones from the foxes. There were bright green grass stains and yellow pollen from the marigolds she had picked that morning. It looked just fine to her.
Why don't you get rid of all those ugly weeds, wild girl?
Ivy glanced around at the overgrown garden she loved so much. Ugly? Grandmother's garden was perfect. She couldn't imagine why anyone would want to change it.
Grandmother uses these plants in her healing potions, even the weeds. So we let them all grow. Besides, they're fun to play in. Want to play hide and seek? I'll be it.
My father says this place is a disgrace. He says the only reason anybody puts up with you two is that your grandmother's a healer. And my mother says I'm not allowed to get dirty, so I'm not allowed to play with you.
Me neither,
said the girl's little sister, Marta.
Me neither,
said Peter, who lived next door. Then he stuck out his tongue.
That's what you always say,
Ivy answered them. She stuck her tongue out at Peter.
My father says that Broom Sweep is the cleanest, most orderly town around. Except for you,
continued Edwina.
Who knows what's going on with all those wild animals you keep? Besides, everybody else sweeps their front steps twice a day, and you sweep yours only once.
Well, maybe that's because it's silly to sweep them twice a day.
Edwina's eyes grew larger. Her mouth hung open.
I'm telling my papa what you said.
Go ahead,
exclaimed Ivy, acting like she didn't care. She heard Grandmother calling her from the front steps and turned. Ivy could see that she was talking to Farmer Higley about his piglet. Ivy made her way through the azalea bushes to the front walkway, leaving the children to stare after her. She took the piglet in her arms and sat down, crooning softly to him until he settled into her lap.
Good little pig,
she said, petting him.
Nice piglet.
Let's have a look,
said Grandmother, sitting down next to her on the steps.
Hey, look at the piggy!
Edwina shouted from the road. She nudged Peter with her elbow.
You mean the little pink one with the curly tail?
Asked Peter, smirking.
No, I mean the one that's holding him,
yelled Edwina. The 3 children laughed hysterically at this. They pointed at Ivy and chanted,
Piggy, piggy, piggy.
as they ran away. Said Grandmother.
They seem to think they're being clever.
I've known donkeys more clever than they are,
Answered Ivy, as if the teasing didn't matter at all. But her eyes were stinging, and there was a big lump in her throat that she couldn't swallow.